What I want to do is I want to start with this image that is called American Progress, and I think you have a copy of it in your Guild Learning booklet. This was a painting that was done in 1872 by a man of the name John Gast. And just ask me a question, how big do you think this painting is if you were going to see it in a museum? Huge, right? It doesn't look like it's absolutely huge. Well, I walked into the museum and I couldn't find it, which room it was in, because it turns out this painting is only about this big, just a little bit bigger than the piece of poster board. But what's important about this painting is the ideas that are conveyed by this painting. And I think they're ideas that were really embodied during Reconstruction, during the latter part of the late 19th century. So as you're looking at that painting, I want you to note a couple of things about it. First of all, the woman who's floating up in the air, right? She's known as Columbia. She becomes sort of a euphemism for American progress, American idealism. And we know she's Columbia because she has that star on top of her head. And doesn't she look angelic? She's got this beautiful long flowing hair. She's got these diaphanous clothes on. She looks very benevolent, right? And what are the two things that she's carrying in her hands as she moves? Anybody right here? A wire. See anything what that wire is? It's a telegraph wire. So she's drawing a telegraph wire behind her, bringing the communication that's necessary as she moves out into the west. And what is she holding in her other hand? Yep. A book. It's a book, actually, that she's holding. So she's bringing this idea of bringing knowledge to the west to the people in front of her. If you look at the right side of this painting, what's that city that you see off in the distance? Do you know? That would be New York. Oh, sorry. New York City, I think. That one. New York City off to the right with the Brooklyn Bridge, which was just being constructed at that moment. And the Brooklyn Bridge was really one of the greatest engineering feats that happened at the end of the 19th century. So Gast is making a gesture towards that kind of civilization that's going on in the East. But if you look to the left, what you see here as she is moving into the west is darkness, right? And what's fleeing in front of her? Native Americans who are fleeing off into the darkness, animals, wild animals that are being pushed farther and farther west. And then if you look at sort of this middle section of the painting, you see domesticated animals, or different kinds of modes of transportation that people were using to get to the west. So donkeys, oxen, different kinds of transportation. And then, of course, the thing that goes along with the telegraph is the railroad. So the whole notion of this painting is depicting the idea of civilization in the East, moving into the darkness of the frontier, into the darkness of the American West, and enlightening it with American ideals of republicanism and democracy. And I use those with the little D's and R's, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. What I want you to do is compare this with another painting. I never that you do not have in your booklet, which is another important painting that I want you to think about. This painting was done in 1848, just at the end of the U.S.-Mexican War, as the United States has finished its sort of first imperial movement into overtaking Mexico. And there's a couple of things that I want you to notice about the differences in these paintings. First of all, Daniel Boone is the man that's pointing off into the west, as if he's Moses leading the people into the promised land from the east coast of America, across Kentucky, and across the Blue Ridge Mountains, into what then was sort of the western frontier in the 1830s and 1840s. And I want you to notice, first of all, that there are no women in this picture. It's all men. It's very masculine, it's very male. It's about a male sort of domination of the American West that will be done with guns, and not, as Columbia is portrayed later, with the idea of enlightenment of the book and the telegraph wire coming along. So there are two very different images of American expansion that are going on. This one is much earlier in the 1840s, as I said, masculine, male, guns, violence, it's oriented towards that. And then by the end of the 19th century, you get that much more female, benevolent view of American imperialism that's embodied in Columbia. And if you study this later on in the Spanish-Mexican War in 1898, that image of Columbia will appear over and over again in U.S. political cartoons and all kinds of images as America begins to sort of push its idealism out into foreign policy. really two bookends that I want you to think about as we're talking today, these two different images of progress and imperialism in the American West. Now, to give you a little historical context of what was going on in 1870 when we're talking about this gas photograph. As you know, in the 1870s, this is the end of Reconstruction. Federal troops are beginning to pull out of the American South, and it's a time of real reordering of American culture and American society in the 1870s. People are really trying to come to grasp and to grips with what the meaning of the Civil War was for them. What does it mean to put a nation back together again after such a devastating war? And as they're doing that, they're beginning to look to the West, and they're beginning to settle the West. You have trains, massive transportation that's moving people into the American West to settle, to grow things, to create economies, to create families and homes. Now, one of the things that was really impeding American movement into the American West, of course, was Native Americans, the societies and the communities that they had established and set up for themselves. And those became a real impediment to Americans because somehow Americans and Indians could just not figure out how to live together and how to create a cohesive society. So as that happens, the military presence that had been so powerful in the American South during Reconstruction, as they're released from those duties of overseeing Reconstruction, they're really sent out onto the American frontier to do the kind of work of removing Indians and putting them onto reservations. Another little piece of context that I want to give you is an event that happened in 1876, and this was the Battle of Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn occurred out on the plains of Montana at the end of June of 1876, and it was a complete rout of the General George Armstrong Custer. Custer had been a great Civil War battle hero. He had then moved out into the American West to subdue Indians, and had quite a reputation for being an Indian fighter and an Indian killer and bringing Indians under his control. But at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he sort of overstepped himself, put himself into a situation in which he was eventually completely surrounded by the Sioux, as you see in this image that was painted later by Frederick Remington in 1890. And he and his entire 7th Cavalry was completely wiped out by the Sioux Indians. It was the greatest Indian victory on the Great Plains in the 1870s, and really marked the pinnacle of success of Native American military resistance against the federal government, against the 7th Cavalry. Now I want you to imagine what this was like for Americans to find out about this in 1876. Most Americans on the East Coast found out about this as they were celebrating their centennial of the new nation. It had been 100 years since 1776, the Declaration of Independence. Americans were feeling very confident, very sure of themselves. They were moving out to the West. They were going to create this great society from Atlantic coast to Pacific coast. And in the midst of that, they got this news that General George Armstrong Custer had been completely wiped out by the Sioux Indians. And the only thing I can use to sort of describe the similarity to you is how would the American people feel today if they found out that an entire unit had been wiped out in Afghanistan? Sort of a project that seems far away, that's about bringing democracy, bringing enlightenment to another group of people, is all of a sudden completely undone by this devastating news of this battle. And so Americans really were kind of shaken by this. And as a result of this, really began a full front assault effort to remove Indians from the Great Plains, place them into reservations, and get them away from American settlers who were making their way into the American West.